Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. And a special welcome to our friends at C-SPAN who are recording today's discussion with Nate Jones about his new book, Able Archer 83, The Secret History of the NATO Exercise That Almost Triggered Nuclear War. Whether you're here in the McGowan Theater or watching on YouTube or C-SPAN, thanks again for coming. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up tomorrow and in February. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., former Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates will be here to discuss his latest book, A Passion for Leadership, Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service. Having led change successfully at three monumental organizations, the CIA, Texas A&M, and the Department of Defense, he offers us the ultimate insider's look at how major organizations can be transformed. And on Wednesday, February 8th at noon, writer and scholar Timothy B. Tyson will be here to discuss The Blood of Emmett Till, his book about the murder of the 14-year-old Till in 1955. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive them by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. It's said that in Washington, the first place people look in a newly published book is the index to see if they're mentioned. Here at the National Archives, I'd venture to say, at the Library of Congress and other research institutions, we look at acknowledgments pages and the bibliography also, looking for ourselves. If you look at the acknowledgments of Able Archer, you'll see that Nate Jones has noted the assistance of several National Archives staff members at the presidential libraries and at the Information Security Oversight Office, known as ISOO. A large portion of the documents upon which he based his story came from the Ronald Reagan and George Bush presidential libraries and from the National Archives, other National Archives holdings. I'm very proud of our staff, some of whom are in the audience today, and it's gratifying to see that others appreciate the work they do, whether it's helping people navigate through our holdings or, as Nate noted, breaking a declassification logjam to release a critical document. Every day in research rooms across the country, we help researchers uncover the stories of our past. And those stories, like today's story of Able Archer, remind us that history is not just what happened 100 or more years ago. As more and more records are processed and declassified, we learn more about the past, even events that have occurred in our own lifetime. Now it's time to have our featured speaker come to the stage. Nate is the director of the Freedom of Information Act project for the National Security Archive at George Washington University. He oversees thousands of Freedom of Information Act and mandatory declassification review requests and appeals each year and is a two-term member of the Federal FOIA Advisory Committee, which will be meeting here tomorrow. He's also the editor of the National Security Archives blog, Unredacted, where he writes about newly declassified documents and FOIA policy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nate Jones.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here at the National Archives, where I spent a lot of time researching but also working on freedom of information and declassification policy. I was here for the first time on this stage about 8 years ago, talking about declassification at NARA. And there's a funny story that I'd like to tell. NARA and the National Declassification Center were just ramping up. And one of their first big projects was the declassification of the Pentagon Papers, which had topically already been leaked and were widely available to the public. And at the time, I was young, it was 8 years ago, the archivist had made the joke that there were just 11 words remaining classified. And I was a bit taken aback, and I came on the stage and a bit pompously said, well, I can solve that Mad Lib, as the archive joked. I'll just go to my public library, get the Gravel edition, and compare the missing words. They got some laughs, some NARA people were not happy. But eventually, it may have worked because through FOIA, an archivist at the Nixon Library, these emails were released via FOIA very quickly, so more credit to them, said in an email to his superiors, well, we found that there is, in fact, another edition. Their Gravel edition didn't have them. It was actually the Armed Services Committee edition did. Has these words that we've redacted. So we should probably release them before someone at the National Security Archive goes around and parades them like a politician on the 4th of July. So that was my first experience, and the National Archives and the National Classification Center declassified the Pentagon Papers officially, and then they went on and on and on and declassified millions and hundreds of more millions of pages and keep doing it. And I must say, I'll talk a little bit about classification later on, but their indexing on demand program at the National Declassification Center should be a model for all agencies, declassification and FOIA. It's great and tremendous progress over the past 8 years getting the secrets out. So, with that, thank you. Let's talk about Able Archer 83. So, what was Able Archer 83? According to the NSA's history, not the National Security Archive where I work, the real NSA, they have an excellent 4-volume history of the Cold War that's one of the best declassified reads I've read. They called the years 1982 to 1984 quote, the most dangerous confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Able Archer 83, held in November 1983, was the crux of this, was a NATO nuclear release exercise that caused an unprecedented nuclear reaction from the Soviets, according to British intelligence, and may have put our nuclear relations with the Soviet Union on hair trigger, according to a U.S. analysis of the incident. In other words, one of the 2 most dangerous moments of the Cold War is largely unknown to the public. In my book, I argue that Able Archer 83 brought the world unacceptably closer to nuclear war, that it had a key effect on our foreign policy, and its effect on its danger helped Reagan decide and lead to the end of the Cold War. Speaking of President Reagan, here's one of his famous note cards. You may know that he always went in the meetings with note cards prepared by his staff, but he used them and used them well. This is a great document from the Reagan Presidential Library. Going back to Able Archer 83, others have downplayed the danger or said that it's simply not even worth studying. One CIA analyst wrote at the time that there was no real danger, and wrote afterwards that the CIA's analysis of the war scare was that since the agency had so many Soviet military cookbooks, it could judge confidently the difference between when they might be brewing up for a real military confrontation or just rattling pots and pans. The response to Able Archer 83, the CIA concluded, was that it was just pot rattling. But another wise CIA analyst that will be here tomorrow night disagreed. Robert Gates, who was Deputy Director for Intelligence during the war scare, wrote, after going through the experience at the time, then through the postmortems, and now through the documents, I don't think the Soviets were crying wolf. They may not have believed a NATO attack was imminent in November 1983, but they did seem to believe that the situation was very dangerous. Rattling pots and pans, crying wolf, or as Reagan asked his advisor to the Soviet Union in early 1984, do you think the Soviet leaders really fear us, or is all the huffing and puffing just part of their propaganda? That President Reagan identified was the key question, and I think he answered it for himself later on, which I'll talk about later. But as I studied this 1983 war scare in Able Archer, and as we talk about today, I think this is what we need to keep in mind. Were the Soviets really scared, or were they bluffing? So, to answer this question, what is a historian to do? Well, when I first started researching this, there is quite a bit of criticism even about Able Archer 83. Some described the research as an echo chamber of inadequate research and misguided analysis, and circle reference dependency with an over-reliance upon the same scanty evidence. Now, I think they were talking about some of my early work, which is fine. And also, they had a good point. If you were to read a history, one of the best history of the Cold War, and go to Able Archer, you would see a note that said, marked the second most dangerous point of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But if you followed the footnotes, it would go to one or two memoirs, or perhaps that Gates quote that I just read, and leave it at that. No primary source evidence. So, what's a historian to do? Get to the archives, get to the presidential libraries, get to the Cold War International History Project, get documents from our NATO allies and adversaries out. Use the Freedom of Information Act, use the mandatory declassification review. Turn to IceCap, get them to break the logjam. We'll talk about how they did that later, maybe. And then share the filings of the New Earth documents. So this is what my book tries to do. It's a narrative and analysis of Able Archer 83, but it also includes the very best primary sources for people to read so they can make their own decision and conclusions about the danger. So let's set the scene. Here we have the data from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, put together kindly by Wikipedia, about the doomsday clock, which is an estimation of how dangerous the world is coming to nuclear war or now environmental catastrophe. And as you see there, in 1983 and 1984, it was dangerous. Some have called this period the Second Cold War. Others have called it the era of renewed confrontation. Mikhail Gorbachev have described the years the most explosive, difficult, and unfavorable since the Second World War. So I won't spend too long running through how we got there, but I will say that it was geopolitical, ideological on the one hand, but also nuclear on the other, and that's key. Geopolitically, there was, of course, the Soviet invasion of 1979 that essentially ended détente. President Carter's focus on Soviet human rights abuses. The United States tilt towards China, and then this was manifested in boycotting of Olympics in both 1980 in Moscow and 84 in LA. But as important as the ideological and geopolitical reasons for this souring of relations was the nuclear reasons. And this started with the Soviets' decision to deploy new SS-20 missiles on their western border, which could reach Europe and escalated the arms race. Later on, they admitted as much in Politburo meetings, saying this was a mistake. My colleague, Tom Blanton, has published a great book, including these minutes. But the Soviets began the Euro missile race. Then NATO responded. 1978, deciding to deploy Pershing II missiles and Griffin missiles into Europe, which were deployed in late November 1983, days after Able Archer 83 had ended. This was extremely unbalancing to the relative geopolitical and nuclear stability. The reason for this was that now the Soviets believed that the Pershings could reach Moscow within 15 minutes. They probably couldn't, but the U.S. wasn't telling the Soviets that. The Pershings could reach Russia and forward deployed Soviet troops within less than 15 minutes. The Griffins could reach Moscow in under an hour, and also the Griffins, in all likelihood, could not be detected by radar. So essentially, the Euro missiles on both sides, but especially the Pershings and the Griffins, changed the balance so that now the Soviets were genuinely fearful of the possibility that they could be hit by a decapitating nuclear attack. That is, all of the work they had done to build up nuclear parity and stay just behind the United States in the arms race had been obliterated or would be obliterated when the intermediate range missiles were deployed to Europe. So this fear of the decapitating strike that was the primary driver of Able Archer 83. It also drove a change to, on both sides, of the consideration and possible application of a strategy known as launch on warning. Now, today in the United States, in the American Nuclear Posture Review, which is unclassified, available on the web, our current posture is launch under attack. And this is scary to talk about and it's surreal to talk about, but these are the facts. Right now, our posture is that if an adversary launches nuclear weapons at us, when they're in the air, we will launch ours to retaliate. In 1983, with the intermediate range missiles and response time of just minutes, both sides considered using and may have used launch on warning. That is, use good intelligence to figure out when your opponent is going to launch an attack at you, and then preempt your opponent so that you can maybe possibly survive and possibly even win the war with low gains. And there's many interviews I cite in the book with Soviet and American scientists after the Cold War's end, morosely joking with each other that if you say that you didn't study that, you're lying, and the other side agreed. So launch of warning is another key driver of Able Archer 83. I'm talking a lot about U.S. Nuclear drills today, but there's one other famous one that I want to briefly mention called Zapad 83, which the Soviet Union practiced in 83. And according to a member of the General Staff, this was the first time since World War II the Soviets actually practiced a drill of obtaining information stating that the adversary was going to attack, and then the Soviets practiced a preemptive strike, including a preemptive nuclear strike. So this was on the minds and being practiced. This leads me to what I'd like to discuss, something called Operation Rion. Operation Rion, sometimes in the West called Operation Ryan, but it's a Russian acronym that stands for Raketno Yaderная Napadение, nuclear missile attack in Russian. And this was, so this document is one of the rare ones that gets your heart beating if you see it. It's a KGB document that actually discusses the creation of Operation Rion, and is, quote, to strengthen our intelligence work in order to prevent a possible sudden outbreak of war by the enemy. And what Operation Rion was a shift from military, satellite, and other intelligence towards human intelligence, with the aim of possibly preempting or discovering and preempting a nuclear war. It began in 1979 and was announced in 1981 when Yuri Andropov, who was then the head of the KGB, announced it. He said it was because the West was actively preparing for nuclear war. The primary accounts of Operation Rion, until recently, was primarily from a man named Olev Gordievsky, who we'll talk about later, but he was a high-ranking Soviet KGB official, at one point the #1 official in the London residency, that defected in place and gave lots of good intelligence to Great Britain and eventually the U.S. He eventually, for a long time, was the primary source about Able Archer as well. But now, thanks to the work of the Cold War International History Project, there is a very good web posting of a slew of hundreds of pages of documents of Stasi intelligence about Operation Rion. So we know a bit more. What are some of the things we know about this new program? Involved over 300 new positions created in this KGB, and even more in all of its satellite countries that also spied for Rion. And these positions monitored indicators that their spies abroad reported. Essentially, there was a binder full of 292 indicators that I'll talk about in 1 second that spies abroad, in addition to all their other duties, had to report back on. Some of these were probably smart, like monitoring nuclear missile sites, monitoring political and military figures. Others were probably far-fetched, such as monitoring blood banks or monitoring priests. The thinking was that if you have enough data, big data as early as 1981. You can input this data and determine what is going to happen. The Soviets also, according to the reports, credible reports, invented a rudimentary computer system to track this data. And what this meant was that the agents abroad were swamped with more work, but they did not complain. They reported. And one of the interesting things they reported actually applies to where we are today. One of the things that agents were tasked to monitor was the state of the Constitution, Declaration, and other founding documents at the U.S. National Archives. The thinking being that if the Imperial West was going to launch a nuclear strike, they would hide their documents first. The archivist today told me that that's not unprecedented, and it did happen during World War II. These Ryan Watchers also going through the documents, pretty fascinating. Two things that you can kind of tell. One is you can tell where they had good sources and good agents within the U.S. government because there was much more reporting. These are Stasi documents. And the second is that you could tell that from a pretty early point, they did a pretty good job ferreting out and reporting on continuity of government operations, which essentially is the plane that the president would fly on during the nuclear war. And they also monitored that. Ominously, they also include several indicators that would have been included during Able Archer 83, this nuclear release exercise that coming up we'll talk about. It's including troop mobilizations, changes in communications used to launch nuclear weapons, and new methods of transmitting weapons. Of course, Rian was searching for something that did not exist. Western plans for a decapitating strike were not in the making. Possible reasons for this were bureaucratic expansion. Would not be the first time an intelligence agency created an enemy or created a greater threat of an enemy for more work for itself. Possibly socialist dogma. Maybe they really did believe that, some did believe that socialism was going to lose to capitalism and they should go out with a last gasp. Or maybe perhaps even a cockamamie scheme to inject R&D through Soviets were not having great success making computers otherwise. But I think the best explanation was actually coined by Gordievsky, who first reported it. He called Operation Rian a vicious circle of intelligence collection assessment, where Soviet intelligence operatives abroad were required to report alarming information to Moscow about a Western surprise strike, even if they themselves were skeptical of it. After the Moscow Center received these inflated and incorrect, but requested, reports of Western preparations for a surprise nuclear strike, it became duly alarmed by what had been reported and demanded more. The day after. Anybody remember this? So shifting from secret fear of nuclear war to very public fear of nuclear war. The 1980s, I'm sure many here remember clearly, and remember Able Archer, perhaps, hopefully, we'll talk afterwards clearly. But it wasn't just private fear, it was very public fear. This is an America One item I chose to symbolize the year of 1983. And this was a very realistic movie about nuclear war that aired on national television. Ronald Reagan actually watched this days before Able Archer 83. He had seen an advanced screening. In his diary, he wrote that it was very well done and left me feeling greatly depressed. And I've spoken with Reagan watchers, and they say that it's probably the only or one of the few. I could not find any more of him writing of depression, great fear. So it may have primed him. He also watched a movie that's a little bit more uplifting than this, Matthew Broderick's War Games, and greatly enjoyed that one as well. While we're talking about movies, there's another one from 1983 that most people, or lots of people haven't heard of, called Threads, which was from the UK. And that was actually based on a parliamentary, I believe, inquiry, British, about what exactly would happen after a nuclear war. In essentially 5 generations lost. And that one was even bleaker than this. This fear of nuclear war was widespread in the United States and the Soviet Union, as we'll talk about. It also was manifested in a protest movement that worked well and largely achieved its objectives, the nuclear freeze movement, which also had a large effect on President Reagan. And here's the president speaking to the Evangelical Association in Orlando. So the president's rhetoric also contributed to the nuclear danger. In June of 1982, he addressed the British Parliament and said that he would put the Soviet Union in the ash heap of history. He gave this well-known speech in Orlando in March of 1983, although it was not cleared by the State Department or anyone outside of the White House and was focused on domestic policy. It had a huge impact on foreign policy. He called the Soviets the evil empire and deemed them the focus of evil in the modern world, which, if you look on the writings from the other side, had great effect on Soviet Union geopolitically and strategically. They did not get that, as some have claimed, it was firing up the base. I think the best description of this that, again, my colleague and director Tom Bland has written about is called The Paradox of Ronald Reagan. And one of the best to describe it was Anatoly Dobrynin, the ambassador to 5 U.S. presidents. As Dobrynin masterfully explained, the paradox of Ronald Reagan was that the president saw nothing contradictory in publicly, and I think sincerely, attacking the Soviet Union as the evil empire and describing its leadership in rather uncomplimentary terms, while in the next moment writing personal letters in his own hand to the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, very privately expressing his desire for a non-nuclear world, better Soviet-American relations, and a summit meeting with the world's chief communist and atheist. Reagan's vision of nuclear apocalypse and his deeply rooted but almost hidden conviction that nuclear weapons should ultimately be abolished would ultimately prove more powerful than his visceral anti-communism. Though not, I argue, though not until after the 1983 war scare had showed him the brink. Two other brief examples of this paradox of Ronald Reagan are weak, and I think David Hoffman's recent excellent book, The $1 Billion Spy, showed that another part of this and the reliance on human intelligence was that the Soviets' radars were weak everywhere, and that they could not detect or possibly protect their borders from American incursions, including nuclear strikes. But while the president was hoping for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and sometimes publicly wanting to work with the Soviets, and sometimes very privately begging the Soviets to change the world, he was also increasing the military, publicly calling them the evil empire, and secretly having secret military actions against the Soviet Union. The fear was not just in America, it was in the Soviet Union too. One very interesting declassified memo from the Reagan Presidential Library from U.S. Soviet advisor Jack Matlock to National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, written in December 1983, but describing the 6 months previous, said that for the past 6 months, there was a fear of war that seemed to affect the elite as well as the man on the street on the Soviet Union, according to a well-respected source. A growing paranoia among Soviet officials, and that they were literally obsessed by fear of war, and that irrationality and unpredictability of the Soviet officials not seen since 30 years previously, which was the reign of Stalin, just after World War II. The danger of the fear of war and fear of preemption can actually be seen in a conversation between then General Secretary Yuri Andropov and one of the few meetings between a U.S. envoy, Averell Harriman, who had previously negotiated with Stalin and was a Democrat, but was unofficially sent by the Reagan administration. He says that he was a private citizen, But the documents show he traveled with the State Department translator and was pre-briefed and debriefed by the State Department. But during his conversation with Andropov in August 1983, Harriman said, Andropov stridently risked of the risk of nuclear war through miscalculation 4 times, and warned that, quote, they were moving towards the dangerous red line of nuclear war. Then, amid these pledges of destruction of the evil empire, the danger of launch on warning, the quiet danger of Operation Rion, and the fear of war affecting the elite as well as the man on the street, KAL 007 occurred. The Soviet Union shot down a U.S. civilian airliner that had errantly strayed into Soviet airspace. This ended any hope of improved relations, which was dim, and ratcheted up the fear of war, the tensions even further. Here's what Reagan wrote about the KAL shootdown in his memoirs. If, as some people speculated, the Soviet pilots simply mistook the airliner for a military plane, what kind of imagination did it take to think of a Soviet military man with his finger close to a nuclear push button making an even more tragic mistake? And as some of you guys probably know, mistakes like this happened multiple times throughout the Cold War, which we can talk about during the questions, but I won't go into now because as a mistake by pushing the button is a bit different than war through miscalculation. So, a month after KAL, Able Archer 83 began. Again, Able Archer 83 was a 5-day NATO exercise conducted at the end of Autumn Forge 83. Now, some of you guys, it's a little hard to see, but have any of you guys watched the recent television show Deutschland 83? Yeah? It's a good show, and it's about Able Archer 83. It's a German show. And they contacted me, and I helped them get some of the historical facts straight. But a very cool Easter egg is that each of the episodes of this serial come from an operation from Autumn Forge 83. So there's Northern Wedding. You can see Summer Jump, Display Determination, others. And that's a cool Easter egg that I'd like to share with you. But to understand Able Archer 83 is very key to understand what exactly it was. Each year, there was an annual Able Archer exercise, and there was an annual Autumn Forge exercise. It was how NATO prepared for war against the Soviet Union. Autumn Forge was large. As you can see, it had about a dozen exercises under it, preparing troops in lots of places, about 20,000 troops, including some 16,000 American troops that flew over. And this was practicing conventional war and went on for months. Able Archer 83 was the last final exercise of this, essentially practicing the shift from conventional war to nuclear war and how to fight it. And this is important to understand because there have been some histories that cited Soviet generals saying, I've never heard of Able Archer 83, showing that there was no danger. But in the same interviews, the general said, Autumn Forge, that was always the most dangerous. So Able Archer came at the end of Autumn Forge 83. So because it was so hard to get this declassified, I'd like to share with you what it practiced. How did nuclear war look in 1983? So here's the backstory. There's a sudden change in leadership in the Kremlin. A new unstable leader takes over. Then the fledgling leadership begins fighting proxy wars in the U.S. By providing political and military support to rebels in Iran, Syria, South Yemen. Eventually, months later, this conflict spreads from the Middle East to Europe. And due to this failing economy, the Soviet Union was unable to continue providing support to its satellites. But while the Eastern European economic situation worsened, the military preparedness improved. Frequent field exercises were conducted. Equipment was stockpiled. Factories produced material around the clock. Then, in this backstory, in August 1983, Yugoslavia shifted toward the west, requesting economic and military assistance from several NATO countries. Fearing other Eastern European states would join the shift to the west, the Warsaw Pact invaded Yugoslavia. Then the ground war broadened. Soviet forces invaded Finland on October 31st. The next day, Norway. The next day, they attacked Germany. By November 4th, Soviet and Warsaw forces had invaded West Germany, bombed this entire eastern border. But because NATO forces provided strong resistance, the Soviets began launching chemical attacks. NATO responded in kind. That's the backstory. Now this is the part that American and European nuclear officers on the ground in Europe began practicing when conventional and chemical war turns nuclear. Unable to repel the Soviets' ground advance, NATO attempted to send a message to the Warsaw Pact via nuclear signaling, the destruction of one city in the hope of averting total nuclear war. I talked to the ambassador to NATO, and he said that in the scenarios, this city was usually Kyiv, and the Soviets usually responded with Boston. On the morning of November 8th, NATO requested permission for, quote, initial limited use of nuclear weapons against pre-selected fixed targets, signaling. The Western capitals granted NATO permission to destroy an Eastern European city with a nuclear attack. But Blue's, the West's, use of nuclear weapons did not stop Orange's aggression. As a result, the next day the leader of NATO requested follow-on use of nuclear weapons. Washington and the other capitals approved this request, and on November 11th, nuclear war had broken out. That was Able Archer 83. Here's President Reagan with Oleg Gordievsky. Of course, the great one irony was that while NATO was practicing a long, slow, drawn-out transition from conventional to nuclear war, the Soviets were most fearful of a bolt from the blue, and as such were misreading indicators. And Able Archer 83 did indeed have many special wrinkles that other previous Able Archer exercises did not, that could have and would have been misreported as by Rian indicators to the West. And here I want to take a minute to talk about Oleg Gordievsky, a good book about this, Gordievsky. But he was able ultimately to escape across the Finnish border in the trunk of a car, and eventually made it and met with Reagan and did a large tour throughout the U.S., and he's still alive. He was also the first person that sounded the alarm during Able Archer 83. So here are some wrinkles of Able Archer 83 that could have been picked up during Rian. Testing of new communication methods for nuclear release. I spoke with NATO officers in the field that said that they had just been trained on new encryption techniques to launch these new missiles during Able Archer, and that could have and would have been reported by Rian. Nuclear release procedures, including practicing launching Griffin and Pershing II missiles. The fact that some U.S. aircraft practice nuclear handling procedures, including taxiing out of hangars carrying realistic dummy warheads. The 170-flight radio-silent airlift of 16,000 soldiers to Autumn Forge AG-3, of which Able Archer was the final component. This would have been reported. During Able Archer 83, the shifting of command from permanent war headquarters in Mons to a field headquarters, simulating the destruction. This was an indicator that agents were tasked to look for and report. And including to one document declassified by the U.S. Air Force, the, quote, sensitive political issue of, quote, slips of the tongue, in which B-2 sorties were mistakenly referred to as nuclear strikes over open radio, which actually, in the U.S. side, climbed the ladder as a reporting of danger, even without knowing of Rian. These wrinkles, according to Oleg Gordievsky, caused both the KGB and GRU to send flash telegrams to residencies in Western Europe on November 8th, when Able Archer, the nuclear phase began, or 9th, he doesn't recall which, reporting, quote, an alert on U.S. bases. According to Gordievsky, the flash telegrams clearly implied that one of several possible explanations for the alert was the countdown to nuclear first strike had actually begun. So, for years, we only had this Gordievsky account. That may have been, well, some called it the echo chamber of evidence. But just last year ago, here, people at the National Archives finally broke through the logjam and declassified another key retrospective account. And this is probably the most comprehensive. It's all source. As you can see, it has, I think, 7 code words on the top. Most of the stuff leaked by Snowden only had 3. And it was an all-source review, and that's where much of the wrinkles I just described come from. There's also been some declassification by British intelligence describing what they saw. But essentially, what we now know through declassification is that this is what the Soviet reaction was, in addition to the memo, Gordievsky said. They were, quote, unparalleled in scale and included transporting nuclear weapons from storage sites to delivery units by helicopter, suspension of all flight operations from November 4th to 10th, probably to have available as many aircraft as possible for combat, initiated unprecedented technical collection against Able Archer 83, including over 36 overflights, significantly more than previous exercises. Soviet air units in East Germany and Poland went on alert, in heightened readiness in what was declared to be a threat of possible aggression against the USSR and Warsaw Pact countries. Nuclear weapons were transported from storage sites to delivery vehicles via helicopter, and as the CIA Director Casey wrote to Reagan in 1984, the behavior of the armed forces is perhaps the most disturbing. From the operational deployment of submarines to the termination of harvest support to the delayed troop rotation, there's a central theme of not being strategically vulnerable, even if it means taking some risks. The military behaviors we have observed involve high military costs, adding thereby a dimension of genuineness to the Soviet expressions of concern that is not often reflected in intelligence issuances. And beyond that, there have been a series of interviews with Soviet generals and members of the general staff saying that Soviet nuclear forces, in fact, did go on alert during Able Archer 83, and reports that Orgarkov monitored the situation from a bunker outside of Moscow. And right after you read some of those in there, there's about a good page and a half that remains blacked out, redacted, so possibly, probably even more. This is funny, and maybe we'll get it to questions, but I want to wrap up. This is an example of declassification not as good as is what is usually provided by the National Archives. During my research, I did a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to the National Security Agency for documents about Able Archer. And they said, we have 83 documents, and we will give you one of them. And the one they gave me was this one, a printout of a Wikipedia article that had been processed and declassified, and the worst punch in the gut was I'd spent a lot of time being the actual guy that edited the Wikipedia article. But the good news is that was early, and I got so upset and angry by this that I was even more determined to file the FOIAs and file the MDRs and work my way all the way up to IceCap, which we can talk about later, which ultimately got this document released, the key document. So it was a blessing in disguise. All right, so wrapping up, and then we can talk about other things in the discussion. The danger of Able Archer 83, according to all the information we have now, ended when a young Air Force officer in charge of Able Archer 83 minimized the risk by doing nothing in the face of evidence that part of the Soviet armed forces were moving to an unusual level of alert. That officer was Leonid Perutz on the left. Perutz's action to do nothing is described, not glowingly, as fortuitous if ill-informed. These officers acted correctly out of instinct, not informed guidance, for in the years leading up to Able Archer, they received no guidance as to the possibility significance of the apparent change in Soviet military and political thinking. So I want to quickly walk through what the U.S. intelligence community learned and that debate that now has become onto the scholarly community and the public. So the first to report Able Archer 83 was the British. There were DIA reports at the time, but they missed it. They said that there was increased Soviet surveillance, but did not get the other stuff. The key report is a British report entitled Soviet Union Concern About a Surprise NATO Attack, which combined Gordievsky's reporting with after-the-fact satellite intelligence and human intelligence, and according to sources I've spoke with, was written by a man named Harry Burke. Unfortunately, this key first report of the danger remains classified. I did a long fight through the British system and lost. So in this case, the American system is better. But this information did make it to the US. By May of 1984, the CIA used this intelligence on a report entitled Implications of Recent Soviet Military Political Activities, but they concluded that there was no danger of nuclear war through miscalculation, the opposite of what the British concluded. There's even, after the British report, Margaret Thatcher even instructed her cabinet, her intelligence ministers rather, to urgently consider, quote, how to approach the Americans and ameliorate the risk of war through nuclear miscalculation. And this emissary was essentially brushed off by the State Department. And then this May 1984 report downplaying the dangers was written. But in June, a month later, Director Casey wrote the memo I quoted for, saying that there was indeed danger. The next day, people from the DIA wrote a memo to him saying, don't tell the president that, retract it. And maybe this nuclear danger would have remained a blip if it had not been for General Peretz again. After his service in Europe, he joined the DIA, eventually becoming the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. When he retired in 1989, he wrote one final swan song, a memo that the DIA still has not declassified, describing what happened to him during Able Archer 83, the danger, and his anger and concern that this danger of nuclear war through miscalculation had been hidden and not analyzed properly. He sent it to the Central Intelligence Agency, where it was buried and received almost no response. He also sent it to the President's Board of Foreign Intelligence, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which was a board that independently advised the President. They took up the issue. Nina Stewart, pictured there, wrote the report, interviewed over 100 participants during Able Archer 83. As you saw in the classification markings, had essentially all access and wrote what I think is close to the definitive review of the danger. Eventually, the existence was leaked to a historian, Don Oberdorfer, and eventually other historians, including myself, followed the footnotes and filed MDRs for this document. Took about 12 years because the Bush Presidential Library under NARA, great people there, but they don't have the authority to declassify. They had to get permission from 12 agencies. One of these agencies, which wouldn't even say who it was the CIA, didn't do any action on it, and it was stuck there. Thank goodness there's one last body at the National Archives called ISCAP, the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel, which is set up through executive order, it still stands, and states that when an agency can't declassify something or takes too long, a panel of experts from other agencies here at NARA can review the document and release what no longer which no longer would harm national security. They did, and the public now knows. Thank goodness. All right, finally, 3 points in my conclusion. I think the first is the power of leadership. President Reagan ultimately understood that a world on hair trigger is unacceptable and contributed to winding down the Cold War. Upon learning of the danger of Able Archer 83, Reagan, quote, expressed surprise and, quote, described the events as really scary. He also learned from the danger of Able Archer 83 in the war scare. In his memoir, he answered the question that he asked in that note card that we showed earlier. He wrote in his diary just after Able Archer 83 and then changed it a bit in his memoirs later that 3 years, quote, 3 years had taught me something surprising about the Russians. Many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy were genuinely afraid of America and Americans. Perhaps this shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I think many of us in my administration took it for granted that Russians, like ourselves, considered it unthinkable that the United States would launch a first strike against them. But the more experience I had with Soviet leaders and other heads of state who knew them, the more I began to realize that many Soviet officials feared us not only as adversaries, but as potential aggressors who might hurl nuclear weapons at them in a first strike. The president then, in tandem with Gorbachev, the Soviet leader he could do business with, eliminated an entire class of intermediate-range missiles, including the Pershing II's, Griffins, and SS-20s. Next, the two negotiated on the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, signed by Gorbachev and H.W. Bush, which reduced the number of warheads and ICBMs to 6,000 and 1,000 respectively. The mutual trust generated by these nuclear reductions was key to helping the two leaders eventually attain the peaceful end of the Cold War. The 1983 war scare served as a fulcrum that pivoted U.S.-Soviet relations from the worst days of the Cold War to their best cooperation since World War II. The second lesson, I think, is the lesson that the Cold War was a dangerous era that we're lucky to have survived and was not, as some have written, a long peace. The study of the previously secret history of the 1983 war scare forces the reevaluation of one of the core claims of Cold War historiography, that the Cold War was slowly wound down after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, the danger of nuclear confrontation remained constant, and at times, including during Able Archer 83, escalated. The fact that an unacceptably high risk of nuclear war continued to exist during Able Archer 83, 21 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, undermines the theory of nuclear deterrence and the idea that because World War III was avoided, the Cold War was actually the long peace. As both sides continue to increase the lethality of nuclear weapons, their own vulnerability increased. Despite the protestations and advocates of so-called nuclear learning and treatises explaining how nuclear game theories ameliorated the risk of actual war, both superpowers became more unsafe as the Cold War progressed. While the United States and Soviet Union maintained relative nuclear parity, each lacked nuclear security. The explanation to this nuclear paradox is simple. Theories don't shape the course of human events. People do. And finally, I believe Able Archer 83 has lessons for today. The best way to ensure that the danger of nuclear war continues to decrease is to not hide it. Andropov and Reagan relied upon classified information unavailable to the public to realize the untenable nature of the nuclear arms race in the early 1980s. It is difficult to justify the initial concealment of how potentially lethal Able Archer 83 was, much less now, 30 years after the fact, 33 years. Finally, after many long Freedom of Information Act battles fought by the National Security Archives and documents declassified by people in this room, most, but not all, of the U.S. documents on the war scare have been declassified, and other countries are trickling out to the public. The continued study of the 1983 war scare will help to avert current and future nuclear standoffs, reduce the probability of nuclear war through miscalculation, and help battle against dangerous ideas held by some keepers of the keys. Across the mall from us. The Soviet SS-20s and American Pershing IIs and Griffins have been removed and retired. The Cold War has ended. The Soviet Union no longer exists. 30 years later, a fuller picture of the dangers of Able Archer 83 has finally emerged, and the lesson is soberingly clear. Throughout the Cold War, as Reagan wrote, one misstep could trigger a great war. We cannot return. Thank you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has. Please ask at the microphones.
Thank you very much for the presentation. As you described, as far as maybe expanding on that, the Air Force officer who did nothing, there was a Russian, I don't know if he was an officer, that saw satellite data that showed 5 missiles coming his way that were clouds that reflected the sun. I'm curious from that incident, as well as others that historically have happened, what procedures, obviously getting rid of the nuclear weapons is a good step, but the red phone aspect that occurred between the hires up that you said, folks that hold the keys, what procedures might have changed from that incident with Able Archer 83?
Sure. So first to mention on General Petrov, who essentially there was misworking Soviet satellites, again, that sent information that a nuclear warhead was coming his way, and he too did nothing. He actually told his superiors that it was a false alarm, that according to the reporting by David Hoffman, he broke procedures and said, trust me, it's nothing, I know. My gut says that they wouldn't launch one missile, and I know the satellite doesn't work. There is another, in a great document a Soviet document of Yuri Andropov, he was speaking, he said, we could be annihilated by an American drunk pushing the missile. So the Soviets too were scared, or a narcotic addict, it was his actual quote, of someone in the US military doing that. There's a story that many people know of Brzezinski later getting a call that 4,000 ICBMs were on the way, and he was calm for 1 minute, and then he got another call saying, don't worry, it was someone had just put in the training tape. So these happen over and over and over again. The only real solution that I'm aware of, the best solution, is the reduction of nuclear weapons, taking weapons off hair-trigger posturing, which they still are. The nuclear telephone, so-called the red line, that we now have actually stalled during the Reagan administration and was greatly expanded after. So that's one safe measure. But the greatest absent of having fewer nuclear weapons is having them off hair-trigger alert. Thanks.
Thank you for this quite interesting presentation. You know, I'm not from America, I'm from the Caribbean, you know. And, you know, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously, and I was very, very small. And I do remember sitting with my parents listening to, although they claim that I made it up, that I have a good imagination, I made it up. Absolutely not. This is what happened. I was a very small kid, I mean, extraordinarily small. And I remember them sitting on the porch, listening to the Soviet ships coming closer and closer to the quarantine, right? And the ships, at a certain moment, stopping. And I'm a kid, obviously, I'm trying to figure out what is this, what can this, I mean, how to make sense of this. And the only thing I could do is think it's some type of hellish activity. But be that as it may, so I do have experience with I grew up in the Netherlands, so I was part of the demonstrations against the nuclear American war. But a few questions, because what you do here, I think, is quite important, especially with more and more countries coming online that become more and more powerful, right? China, India, the nuclear weapon, the nuclear problems potential problems between India and Pakistan, right? What level of control do these people have over the thing? What level of radar systems they have back and forth to be able to do this? So do you know anything about that? Has there been any talk about that, what to do about this issue? And also, I think what helped tremendously with stopping really a nuclear war from happening between the Soviet Union and the United States is that from the very beginning, think about Oppenheimer's first word, right? I've become dead. Both, and the dissident, well, I forgot his name. Sakharov, right? Who, when he saw this thing explode, like, no, this is just this is nonsense. We cannot do this. This cannot be done. But think about it if it was a competition between the United States and, for example, China, where, for example, Mao Zedong thought it was kind of a joke. We have enough of people. A few 100 million is no problem to us, right? Just less people, but we will have hundreds of millions more. You know, the issue is that if both intellectual classes and technical classes and military classes don't read this thing the same way, right? And what you have been talking about is what political scientists call a security dilemma, right? The security dilemma is a horrific, dangerous thing when you have nuclear weapons. So how do you see all of these things playing out? And I totally agree with you that we need a new movement, popular movement across the world to really put an end to these nuclear weapons. And now we have a new guy coming in who claims he might be going towards more nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you see this thing playing out in the future? And the last question, because you talk about the issue of getting documents, right? We've known that over the last few years in different presidencies, there have been attempts now to try to hide more documents. How do you see that playing out going forward? Thank you.
Sure. So I would say the big, most difficult answer, I think, is that the truest risk of nuclear war is not through two leaders pushing the button. It's war through miscalculation, or war through non-proliferation, or war from events spiraling out of control. I think we saw how that could have happened during Able Archer, and we know how that could have happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the straightforward use of nuclear weapons as they are intended is not the greatest risk. How to combat that? Well, I think my small way is through writing history of nuclear history and trying to get the secrets out so the public knows this danger more fully, or can rely on the historical documents instead of memoirs or the echo chamber, as I said earlier. And I'll say I love working with the Nuclear History Project, International History and Nonproliferation Project at the Wilson Center, and my work, the National Security Archive. So as a historian, that's my way of fighting, is showing the danger and getting the stories out and getting people that had second thoughts in these governments and said so secretly to make that public. The last question about how to make sure we have access to documents going forward, it's going to be a challenge, but historians and people that love FOIA, it's always a challenge, are fighters. We know how to fight the Department of Justice to get the documents out. We know how to write good MDR requests. We know that people that work in the archives are driven by getting the documents out as well. So I'm optimistic that our declassified history will keep flowing.
And we're out of time. Thank you, Nate.
Sure thing.
Nate will be upstairs outside the archive store signing copies of his books, and you can ask some more questions.
Sure thing.